Good afternoon, and welcome to this Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the state of judicial independence in Central America. I extend a special welcome to our witnesses, who I will introduce shortly, and to Co-Chair Smith. Congresswoman Norma Torres, a member of the Executive Committee of the Human Rights Commission, will be joining us soon, and I look forward to her participation and to anybody else who comes on. I'll recognize them. One housekeeping note, this hearing has a hard stop at 2 p.m. today. I asked my colleagues and the witnesses to keep that in mind and try to keep their remarks to 5 minutes in keeping with the usual House practice so we can make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers. The issue we will examine today is not new. The United States has sought to strengthen Central American judiciaries since the 1980s. Between fiscal years 2010 and 2020, U.S. government agencies obligated more than $634 million to support legal and judicial development and anti-corruption organizations and institutions in Central America. Most of the funds were allocated to the three countries of the Northern Triangle: El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. The U.S. did this because we have known for a long time that the judicial systems in the region work mostly to protect the interests of the powerful elites, while serving as instruments of repression against the majority of citizens. We did this because we understand that strong judicial systems with truly independent investigators and prosecutors are essential for fair and just governance. The role they play in protecting human rights is irreplaceable. Some progress was made. For example, between fiscal years 2017 and 2019, USAID reported that the number of convictions by U.S.-supported prosecutors increased threefold in El Salvador and Guatemala and tenfold in Honduras. But as we will hear today, what we're seeing now is dramatic backsliding. The international anti-corruption institutions, CICIG and MOXIE, that inspired so much hope for thousands of people in Guatemala and Honduras, have been dismantled. In El Salvador, CCS is on its way to the same fate. Brilliant, committed judges and prosecutors, often women, are subjected to unending, baseless legal complaints and have been forced to flee their countries. I'm thinking of Claudia Paz, who is a witness today. I'm thinking of Claudia Escobar, Thelma Aldana, Douglas Melendez, and most recently, Gloria Porras. Constitutional courts are being remade to cater to the whims of authoritarian leaders looking to eliminate any semblance of democracy. And I'm not just talking about Nicaragua. Guatemala's slow-motion stacking of its constitutional court is essentially no different from El Salvador's mass dismissal of constitutional court magistrates. And civil society leaders whose commitment to human rights and democracy is such an important driver for positive change are also facing increasing threats and attacks. Some, like Berta Cáceres, have been murdered. The trial of David Castillo for Berta's murder is taking place as we speak, right now. And it is a crucial test case of whether any judicial independence remains in Honduras. Others, like Helen Mack in Guatemala, are being inundated with trumped-up legal charges in a thinly disguised effort to delegitimize her. So let me be clear. We see through this stuff. We know these human rights organizations. We know these human rights organizations. We know these civil society leaders. We know the investigators. We know the prosecutors. We know the judges. We know the ombudsman. They are not the Central Americans being investigated in New York and Miami for drug trafficking and being sanctioned for corruption and human rights violations. They are not the ones lining their own pockets at the expense of the people they're supposed to be governing. So I'm glad that the Biden administration is talking about human rights as a centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. We will see what that means as their policies become clearer. I welcome the creation of the new anti-corruption task force for Guatemala and expect it means the end of efforts to dismantle FACE, and as well as dismantling the high-risk courts. I support USAID's decision to take funds away from the Salvadoran institutions that Mr. Bukele just gutted and redirect them to civil society instead. But I think we all can agree that these steps are barely a start. We need an entirely new strategy toward the region that truly prioritizes human rights and rule of law as indispensable conditions for ending poverty, hunger, and hopelessness. That is the only way we will bring an end over time to forced migration. Restoring judicial independence is a key pillar for that new strategy. The organizations we will hear from today bring recommendations on how to accomplish that, and I look forward to hearing from them. We will also include in the record guidance from the Inter-American Human Rights System and additional recommendations from the Due Process of Law Foundation. Again, I welcome all of our witnesses. Thank you so much for being here. This is an important topic and one that we need to take very, very seriously. And I'm now happy to turn to Co-Chair Smith for any remarks he wishes to make.
Thank you very much, Chairman, Co-Chair. The topic of today's hearing is one which should garner support on both sides of the aisle. The importance of judicial independence, indeed, is a matter of general principle, embedded among larger principles, namely respect for constitutionalism and the separation of power. Support is widespread. So too for related principles such as fighting corruption and promoting the rule of law. As one of our witnesses, Eric Olson, said, fighting corruption and promoting the rule of law is not a left-wing or right-wing agenda. Problem, of course, is when the principle is distorted to fit an ideological agenda, when, for example, so-called anti-corruption campaigns are applied not in an even-handed manner, but rather as a partisan and ideological tool against one side to advance the interests of the other. The countries of Central America are varied, as we all know, and each is faced with unique problems. Some concerns remain constant, however, such as endemic corruption, social and economic inequality, and ideological polarization. The status of an independent judiciary, likewise, varies from country to country, though there are some troubling trends in the region. In El Salvador, the president has appeared to be moved in a high-handed manner, removing and replacing judges from the constitutional chamber with the support of the National Assembly, where he holds a supermajority. The question with respect to El Salvador, which I would like to hear answered by our panelists, is whether he did so in defiance of the Constitution. In Nicaragua, we see a judiciary which has become an appendage of the authoritarian Ortega regime, too often rubber stamping prosecutorial abuses. Indeed, just yesterday, Nicaraguan opposition leader Felix Maradiaga was arrested and beaten, with his family and supporters questioning where he is being detained. The judicial system has become politicized, with judges and magistrates beholding to the Ortega's Sandinistas National Liberation Front. Pardon me. Jared Genser, an international human rights lawyer with special expertise in arbitrary detention, has worked on more than 50 political prisoner cases over his career, and is the author of the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Submitted testimony to this hearing and said, and I quote in part, "Just yesterday, my pro bono client, Felix Maradiaga, a prominent Nicaraguan activist and presidential candidate, was beaten, detained, and disappeared by Nicaraguan security forces. In recent weeks, Ortega has transparently and brazenly decapitated and politicized the opposition by disqualifying all of the leading candidates most likely to prevail in the opposition's presidential primary vote on August 2nd, 2021, including Cristiana Chamorro, Arturo Cruz, and Felix." He goes on to say, in Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega has completely co-opted the justice system to serve his own interests and consolidate his autocratic rule in the country. Currently, there are more than 120 political prisoners in the country detained on pretextual charges. Judges in Nicaragua often try to provide these detentions with the patina of legitimacy by going through the motions to make what are clearly political show trials appear real, but few are fooled. He goes on and completes his testimony. Ortega has shamelessly exploited Nicaragua's judicial system to eliminate systematically any challenges to his authority. The international community must unequivocally condemn this assault on Nicaragua's democracy, and it must work urgently to restore and fortify judicial independence and the rule of law in Nicaragua and Central America. It is perhaps Guatemala, however, that has received the most attention of late, given the recent visit by Vice President Kamala Harris to the country. My colleague and co-chair, Jim McGovern, and I agree on a lot of things. We have stood shoulder to shoulder on combating the depredations of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, for example, which I greatly appreciate. And I think we would both agree that the independence of the judiciary is under serious attack in Guatemala. Where I think we disagree, however, is where the attack against the independence of Guatemala's judiciary is coming from. I believe an honest examination of the record would reveal that it has come in part from the United States, including under two former ambassadors. Todd Robinson, in particular, who has aligned themselves with left-wing political actors in the country and abroad, has also come from an activist out-of-control UN agency, CSIG, funded in part by the United States, which was the subject of a Helsinki Commission hearing, which I chaired, that examined the role played by CSIG and Russian state actors, principally VTB Bank, sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department, in intervening in Guatemala's legal system and persecuting a Russian family, the Bitkovs, who have fled the long arm of Vladimir Putin. Human rights champion Bill Browder, the man who tenaciously and brilliantly led the campaign for the enactment of the Magnitsky Act and Global Magnitsky, after the government of Russia arrested, tortured, and killed his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, in November of 2009, has championed the Bitkovs case. Mr. Browder testified at my April 27th hearing in 2018 on their behalf and said, in part, inexplicably, VTB Bank gained the legal status as an interested party in the migration case against the Bitkovs with the support of CSIG. In January 2015, a criminal case against the Bitkovs was opened at the direction of CSIG, says Bill Browder. Immediately after that, he testified that, quote, 70 armed police officers raided the Bitkovs' home, arrested Irina, Igor, and Anastasia, and detained them in cages behind the parking garage in the main court building in Guatemala City. The Bitkovs should have been granted asylum, not prison. An earlier appeals court ruled that the Bitkovs' offense was perhaps only administrative in nature and punishable with a fine. Yet Igor was sentenced to 19 years in prison, and Irina and Anastasia were sentenced to 14 years each. We will hear from one of the Bitkovs, Irina, as a witness today. Indeed, this strange alliance between CSIG and the Russian actors and the role played by key left-wing political figures such as attorney Alfonso Carrillo in mediating this alliance met with what I can best describe as incuriosity by former Ambassador Robinson, who has been nominated by President Biden to serve as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs at State. I hope that my Senate colleagues inquire at confirmation as to the reasons for this incuriosity, if that's what it was, by Ambassador Robinson with respect to Russia's role with CSIG, and also Russian influence on Guatemala's constitutional court, whose composition was heavily influenced by Mr. Robinson. In that regard, I commend a column from the always excellent Mary Anastasia O'Grady, published this week in the Wall Street Journal, where she states, and I quote, Mr. Robinson's record raises serious questions about his suitability for the job as head of INL. As she points out, as Ambassador, Mr. Robinson, quote, earned a reputation for meddling in domestic politics in ways that went well beyond the scope of his responsibility. He was known, for example, for pressuring Guatemala's Congress to confirm judges aligned with his political views. I ask that Ms. O'Grady's article, as well as a series of articles, again, be entered into the record, and commend them to my Senate colleagues as they consider Ambassador Robinson's nomination. I also commend an excellent statement for the record submitted by Stephen Hecht on Impunity Observer, which elaborates on Todd Robinson's intervention with respect to the composition of Guatemala's constitutional court, in particular with regards to the appointment of former Justice Gloria Porras. And here I must remind this panel that the principle of independence of the judiciary resides within the context of larger principles, namely the importance of constitutionalism and respect for the separation of powers. One cannot, in the name of safeguarding the independence of the judiciary, allow a handful of judges to run roughshod over their constitution and violate the separation of powers. Yet, as amply demonstrated by Mr. Hecht, what the Constitutional Court did under Gloria Porras, where he describes as twice participated in a ruling that stopped Congress from processing cases against her. It is worth noting that prior to her visit to Guatemala, Vice President Harris met quite publicly with both Gloria Porras and Thelma Aldana, the former Attorney General of Guatemala in the United States. Indeed, the reason that meeting was held in the United States and not Guatemala might be because Thelma had 2 outstanding arrest warrants in Guatemala on charges of corruption. This is another area of inquiry for the Senate with respect to Ambassador Robinson. When he appears for confirmation, what was his role in protecting and promoting Thelma Aldana? At our Helsinki hearing, we received testimony that a former Guatemalan official named Myra Veliz was at the heart of a passport and fraudulent document ring. There was incredible allegations involving corruption of RENAP, R-E-N-A-P. Yet instead of investigating her, Thelma Aldana gave Velez a position in the Attorney General's office and protected her. Indeed, we saw the prosecution of low-ranking functionaries by Aldana and CSIG and the disproportionate harassment of the Bitkovs, who received documents after entrusting the Cutino law firm, another politically connected actor, was someone who somehow escaped the scrutiny of Aldana. Thus, I think another line of inquiry for Ambassador Robinson would be the extent of his awareness of Thelma Aldana's role in failing to investigate those officials, such as Myra Veliz, allegedly involved in the distribution of fraudulent documents to foreign nationals. And what were the national security implications to the United States of this apparent incuriosity? To make a final point, and what alarms me, and I believe colleagues such as Senator Marco Rubio and Senator Roger Wicker, who have criticized the intervention of actors such as CSIG and Russia in the workings of the Guatemalan judicial system, are the double standards. Of course, we are against corruption and efforts to undermine the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. But what is so infuriating is that these important principles are so often applied in a one-sided manner and used to advance the interests of the political left. If we are going to fight corruption and defend the rule of law in countries such as Guatemala, it is important that we do so in an even-handed and fair manner, tackling wrongdoing by both political right and political left with consistency, predictability, and commitment. I thank you, and I yield back to my good friend and colleague.
Yeah. Well, I thank the gentleman for his comments, and I think he stated it accurately in the beginning that there's much that we agree on when we talk about human rights and rule of law and how we deal with some of these issues, and there's some stuff that we disagree on. And I would just say that again, this is a serious issue that we need to deal with, because I do think that we see a major backsliding in terms of democracy happening right now in countries. And the gentleman mentioned at the beginning about what's happening in Nicaragua. I should just say, for the record, that one of the opposition leaders that Daniel Ortega has just arrested is a guy named Arturo Cruz Jr., who is a friend of mine and I've known for many, many years. He and I are different politically. I mean, we don't agree on everything, but I worry about his safety, and I think that it is really a sad state of affairs that multiple opposition leaders are now either under house arrest or are in prison, and I think that is a very dangerous thing. And so, anyway, let me go through our witnesses. Eric Olson is the Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives for the Seattle International Foundation. He oversees the foundation's engagement with the DC-based policy community and provides strategic policy advice to the foundation's Central American partners on priority issues, including promoting rule of law, good governance, ending forced migration and displacement, ensuring equity, and strengthening civil society. He's also a Wilson Center Global Fellow, and he's worked for the Wilson Center, OAS, Amnesty International USA, and the Washington Office of Latin America. Claudia Paz is the Director for Central America and Mexico at the Center for Justice and International Law. Prior to joining that organization, she was the first woman to serve as Guatemala's Attorney General. During her term in office, she achieved the conviction of former President Rios Montt for crimes against humanity. Ms. Paz was appointed to the first Inter-American Commission on Human Rights interdisciplinary group of independent experts tasked with investigating the disappearance of the 43 students in Mexico, and to the second GIEI, which investigated the violence in Nicaragua in the wake of the protests in April and May of 2018. Mark L. Schneider is a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the Americas Program and Human Rights Initiative. He has held many positions with the U.S. government, including Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean of the U.S. Agency for International Development, and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department's Office on Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. He also served as Senior Vice President of International Crisis Group from 2001 to 2017. Dr. Jose Luis Gonzalez Duvan is a constitutional attorney and former professor of constitutional law at Francisco Marroquin University, and is the president of Corporation of Specialist Lawyers. He has 48 years of experience in litigation. Dr. Gonzalez is also a columnist, speaker, analyst, and an opinion journalist on the Guatemalan television show Let's Talk. Irina Bitkov fled Russia in 2009 for Guatemala with her husband Igor and daughter Anastasia. Purportedly forced into bankruptcy in Russia, the family claims to have feared for their safety and to have been persecuted by the Kremlin. The family was implicated in an investigation of a passport forgery network, were tried and convicted by Guatemala's public ministry for using fake documents and identities, and were sentenced to long prison terms. They contest their guilt. The convictions were later upheld. One sentence was shortened, and all were converted to house arrest. Brittany Benowitz is Chief Counsel of the American Bar Association's Center for Human Rights. Previously, she served for 4 years as a defense advisor to a senior member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In that capacity, she conducted oversight of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and monitored U.S. counterterrorism, foreign assistance, arms control, and security sector reform policies. She has worked on litigation in civil and criminal courts in the United States and abroad, and conducted human rights investigations in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and South Asia. Welcome to everybody, and we'll begin with Mr. Olson.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you to Co-Chair McGovern and Co-Chair Smith for this opportunity to appear before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission today on behalf of the Seattle International Foundation. We're a small foundation focused on promoting the rule of law, ending forced migration, encouraging equality, and strengthening civil society in Central America. Corruption is the most serious threat to democracy, stability, and prosperity in Northern Central America today. I'm not talking simply about corrupt individuals or a few rotten apples, but about systemic corruption that results in state capture, where accountability is non-existent, impunity pervades, and where elites blame citizens for the free exercise of their rights. Systemic corruption occurs in many ways, sometimes at the point of a gun, but the most common vehicle is through corrupt electoral systems that in turn infect political parties and produce legislatures, governments, and judiciaries that are deeply compromised, eroding their ability to uphold the rule of law. What is transpiring right now in Nicaragua, as both of you have mentioned, is a direct result of systemic corruption and state cooptation. The Ortega regime has utilized a rubber stamp Congress to approve numerous laws specifically designed to undermine independent political actors, the independent media, and civil society. In the past few days, the government has utilized those laws to detain, disappear, threaten, and beat many of the political opponents that are going to wanted to challenge Ortega in the November 4th presidential election. There is no independent judiciary to appeal to, no courts to overrule those laws on constitutional ground. So these abuses continued unabated as we speak. Nicaragua, in my mind, is a warning sign of what can come and is already underway in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. In El Salvador, Supreme Court magistrates and the Attorney General were forced out, and in some cases forced to resign on May 1st when President Bukele's party took complete control of the National Assembly. The apparent reason for this attack against the independence of the justice system was their insufficient loyalty to the president's agenda and daring to limit his authority. According to a statement just this week by OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro, the new Attorney General has blocked numerous investigations into high-level corruption within Bukele's government. In Guatemala, a highly qualified magistrate was pushed aside on a technicality while others linked to corruption by a special prosecutor were confirmed for seats on the Constitutional Chamber by a legislator dominated by the president's allies. The president publicly criticized the special prosecutor, claiming he was pursuing a leftist agenda. And the very Constitutional Court, which now includes those linked to corruption, are now considering a claim of unconstitutionality against the entire special prosecutor's office. In the interest of time, I think I will jump ahead to some of my recommendations, but I do want to highlight a few things on the way. Fighting corruption, as Mr. Smith mentioned, and promoting the rule of law is not a left-wing or right-wing agenda. It is part of the democratic agenda to ensure that the rule of law is strong and governments and criminals are accountable. While the responsibility for this resides squarely with the Central American political and economic elites, the United States also shares responsibility. For too long, the United States has tolerated corruption, looked the other way when other interests are at stake, such as winning the Cold War, fighting drug trafficking, or ending migration. So let me just take, in the little bit of time that remains for me, give a couple examples as policy suggestions that I think the U.S. should consider as it wrestles with this issue. One, I think we must develop a bipartisan commitment to a long-term approach to fighting corruption and building the rule of law in Central America. That commitment existed in 2014 to 2017 and can be reconstructed again by you and others in the Congress. Two, support and champion those few remaining members of the courts and prosecutors' offices that have demonstrated political and prosecutorial independence. They're few and many times overwhelmed, but they exist and we need to support them. Three, provide those independent prosecutors and judges the technical, financial, and political support they need to succeed by creating a buffer between them and the corrupt classes in the region. Four, where government institutions are broken and corrupt, redirect our assistance to independent civil society organizations that have demonstrated a track record of independence on this front. Last week, we helped create and launch a new regional anti-corruption mechanism based on the work of 10 brave and pioneering organizations from all three countries. This is the first such effort ever attempted at the regional and international level. And I think there are many other examples of good efforts from independent civil society to work on corruption and accountability in the region. Four, the United States needs, the United States needs to stand up for and insist that countries comply with the separation of powers clauses embedded in the Democratic Charter. Nicaragua is a clear violator of those separations of power, but we are increasingly convinced that El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras are doing exactly the same. The U.S. must insist that as part of their democratic charter commitments, each country define and respect a transparent public vetting process for the selection of judges, magistrates, and prosecutors, including the internal attorneys general. And seventh, and finally, use a combination of carrots and sticks to incentivize political will and bend the arc towards justice and rule of law. Carrots can be in the form of assistance or privileges that reward positive behavior. Sticks should include sanctions for those directly involved in corruption. These could include public designations and visa removals for the individual and the family members, among other things. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Claudia Paz.
Muy buenas tardes. Muchísimas gracias por esta oportunidad. Como ya se ha dicho, Centroamérica enfrenta enormes amenazas a la independencia judicial. La captura de la justicia es una de las principales estrategias de los grupos de poder para debilitar la democracia y limitar el Estado de Derecho, y así asegurar la impunidad ante la corrupción y las graves violaciones a los derechos humanos. Ejemplos en toda la...
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity. Central America faces enormous threats to judicial independence. The capture of the justice system is one of the principal strategies for powerful groups to roll back democratic systems and the rule of law, ensuring impunity for corruption and human rights violations. Examples from the whole region confirm this. Recently in El Salvador, the new Legislative Assembly, controlled by President Nayib Bukele's party, removed 5 magistrates of the Constitutional Chamber and the Attorney General in an irregular process, illegally naming their replacements and violating the essential principle of separation of powers. In Honduras, a similarly serious situation happened in 2012, when the Legislative Assembly removed 4 magistrates from the Constitutional Tribunal and named a new court which, violating the express text of the Constitution, permitted the 2018 re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez in disputed elections. In Guatemala, the co-optation of the Constitutional Court was consolidated this April with the confirmation of several magistrates close to the executive branch or with party affiliation, and arbitrarily preventing the swearing in of the only independent elected magistrate, Gloria Porras, who, due to criminalization and threats, had to leave the country. In Nicaragua, following successive legislative reforms, the president has been re-elected 3 times, and in practice, it operates as a one-party state. This concentration of power has allowed the appointment of the magistrates allied with the governing party, which has a majority that permits it to appoint judges without support from other political parties. Equally worrying is the lack of independence of attorney general's offices in the region. In Honduras, the Attorney General was appointed without a selection process. In El Salvador, the recently appointed Attorney General unilaterally ended CCS. In Nicaragua, the Attorney General works directly under President Ortega, and in Guatemala, the Attorney General has permitted the office to be used to persecute and criminalize human rights defenders, the independent press, and civil servants in the justice system. 2 of the most serious impacts of the submission of the judicial branch are impunity for grave human rights violations and major corruption cases, and the criminalization of people who fight against it. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has been clear that judges are the principal actors to ensure the legal protection of human rights in democratic states. One clear example of impunity is what followed the serious violations and state repression of protests in Nicaragua after April 2018. In El Salvador, a retroactive law was adopted to ensure immunity for irregularities in purchases of medical treatments for COVID-19. In Guatemala, the investigation and prosecution of major corruption cases is at risk. It was precisely the revelation of the use of illicit campaign financing, with which the economic elites bribed political parties, that triggered the backsliding of incipient efforts to strengthen judicial independence. In Honduras, after months of unjustified delays, David Castillo is currently being tried for the murder of the Lenca activist Berta Cáceres. Corruption in countries with high levels of inequality and poverty is one of the structural causes of migration. Corruption denies access to health, to education, and to security to thousands of people, stealing away hopes for dignified futures for Central Americans. The co-optation of justice also ensures the use of the legal system to criminalize those who challenge power. In Nicaragua, 122 people are still detained for political reasons. The arrests of 4 presidential pre-candidates demonstrate that judges are fundamental players in political repression and in preventing peaceful transfers of power. The criminalization of human rights defenders is a pattern across the region. In Honduras, the defenders of the lands and territory of the Guatemala River have been arbitrarily detained for 21 months. In El Salvador, the principal target of criminalization has been the independent press. Among others, the cases against El Faro. In Guatemala, in addition to the criminalization of human rights defenders and journalists, civil servants in the justice system are also criminalized. The recent arbitrary detention of 2 former prosecutors, Juan Francisco Solórzano Fopa and Aníbal Argüello, is an example of retaliation for investigations into powerful people meant to undermine their credibility in future court proceedings. For all these reasons, we call on the international community, and especially the United States, to take action and support efforts to defend justice and democracy in the region. It is necessary to protect those civil servants who, even in these adverse circumstances, continue their work, as well as the independent press and human rights defenders. The United States should also utilize individual economic sanctions. Finally, political and economic support for civil society is absolutely necessary. In these circumstances, they are the voices speaking out against despotism and abuse of power. Thank you.
Very much. Mark Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman McGovern, Chairman, Co-Chairman, Congressman Smith, I think your decision to hold this hearing underscore your decades-long concerns for human rights and democracy in the Americas. These recent threats to the independence of the judiciary in Central America are not isolated attacks. They're part of a disturbing and dangerous dismantling of democratic institutions in the past decade, not only in the former Soviet Union, but also in the region closest to us, and thus most directly affecting our interests and our security. And as we've heard, Nicaragua's recent gross violations of human rights and basically the destruction of the opportunity for any kind of democratic process and election are only the most horrendous recent example. And I should say that in the aftermath of the Central American conflicts and an end to the Cold War, we'd hope that those countries would have been embarked on a steady path toward greater justice and increased economic opportunity. And we had seen important progress. Sadly, though, those few who traditionally benefited from closed economies, weak governance, and corrupt influence believe they can reverse that progress. First, they went after the international anti-corruption organizations like CICIG and MOXIE, despite clear evidence of important successes. Not perfect, to be sure, but quite breathtaking in historical terms. I listed some in my full statement, some of those successes. Unfortunately, the United States failed to react when they were essentially ousted. Next, the corrupt coalition went after civil society organizations, introducing laws that were first seen in Russia to restrict NGO functioning and to threaten their officers with criminal actions. And finally, they're attacking the system of justice directly. Criminal court judges, appellate and high court justices, and anti-corruption prosecutors. Independent human rights ombudsman in Guatemala will have to close up shop in August if the Congress continues to deny funding. I should just say that even before COVID exacerbated economic misery among the most vulnerable in Central America, the pressures to migrate were high. When people see honest judges being pilloried and deposed and brave attorneys general threatened and forced into exile, why should they risk remaining in communities where those charged with enforcing the law are complicit with those endangering their families? Claudia Paz is doing positive work since leaving Guatemala after serving as prosecutor general, but she should be in Guatemala, not forced to leave her country, nor should her successor, Thelma Aldana, nor their colleague, Douglas Melendez of El Salvador have to go into exile because of death threats and baseless criminal charges. And that's why, obviously, the U.S. government provided asylum to Thelma Aldana. As Vice President Harris has said, people leave because there's a lack of opportunity or it's just not safe. The recent examples of threats against the independence of the judiciary have occurred in El Salvador and Guatemala, as we've heard. Congressman Smith, you asked the question whether the firing of the members of the Constitutional Court and the Prosecutor General and the naming of new ones immediately the single afternoon violated the Constitution. I'd be happy to go into that, but it clearly did. The Constitution, Article 186, provides that the candidates for the Constitutional Court should come from the judicial system. Nothing was done. There was no vetting. There were no nominations. No hearings were held. No examination of past conduct was made public. Instead, the individuals tapped by President Bukele and his party were selected, confirmed, and sworn in virtually in a single afternoon. And that's why both the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, the UN Secretary General, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have stated that El Salvador needs to restore the rule of law and the separation of powers, specifically respecting the independence of the judiciary. And they cited violations of Article 3 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which call for the separation and independence of the branches of government. That separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary is reflected in the constitutions of every country, in almost every country in the hemisphere, including our own. And they date back to Hamilton's argument for an independent judiciary in Federalist 78. Let me turn to Guatemala. The reversal of progress towards strengthening the rule of law began with the ousting of CICIG in 2019 by then President Jimmy Morales, who was himself and remains now the subject of corrupt investigations. Prior to that, CICIG's mandate was reconfirmed every 2 years by the Guatemalan legislature and by, I believe, 4 Guatemalan presidents. Since then, a corrupt coalition has undertaken to roll back the progress Guatemala has made in reducing impunity, and I might add homicides. During CICIG's period, homicides were reduced every year by about 5%, and convictions for those responsible for serious crimes were increased by about 40%. Unfortunately, since then, the attacks have come against the special prosecutor against impunity, the high-risk courts, and the Constitutional Court justices. I just should note that this year, the 2020 State Department Human Rights Report stated specifically on the new selection of Supreme Court that it suffered widespread manipulation of selection committees by politicians, judicial operators, and other influential citizens, including, as we heard when sanctions were announced 6 weeks ago, payments to congressional representatives and judges. Their object was to secure judges who would protect them from current and future prosecution. And then we come to the similarly tainted process for choosing candidates to the Constitutional Court. And as you've heard, the one clearly qualified and thoroughly vetted justice who had earned the applause of Guatemalan international observers, Gloria Porras, was barred by the Congress from taking her seat for a new term, even though she was legally selected for that post. Let me also note, and let's not forget that in Honduras and Nicaragua, the direct threats to the independence of the judiciary are not new phenomena. In Honduras, it's been going on for a decade. In Nicaragua, ever since 2006, Daniel Ortega has increased control over the courts. And those decisions have allowed him multiple terms in office, been complicit in human rights abuses by state authorities, and now we see basically have dismantled the possible political structure of the opposition and put many, at least 4 of the candidates in jail. What needs to be done? And basically it's to follow the procedures on selection and tenure laid out in the UN's basic principles on the independence of the judiciary. The ABA and Due Process of Law Foundation reports clearly state those mechanisms which focus on transparent, independent, merit-based selection processes, and ideally with it, independent and international expert analyses of comparative qualifications. Let me go, what more can the Biden administration and bipartisan majority in the Congress do? Because I believe there is a bipartisan support for dealing with the problems of corruption and injustice. First, make commitment to the rule of law a fundamental benchmark for the nature of our partnership with those governments, including on substantial bilateral economic, financial, and security cooperation beyond humanitarian assistance. And I think the administration should establish an interagency body like the one that's focused on investigating corruption, on corruption and the rule of law when deciding on cooperation. And second, to ensure, and here Secretary Yellen can play an important role, that the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, and the Central American Bank for Integration incorporate those concerns into their own negotiations on budget, macroeconomic, and private sector lending. Where our government has knowledge of private businesses that engage in corruption, we should bar them from investing here or benefiting from our private sector lending, and provide that information to the multilateral banks so that they bar those companies and individuals from receiving their loans as well. Let me just jump to my final recommendation, which is where government institutions, private sector organizations, and civil society groups are pursuing positive steps towards strengthening the rule of law and corruption, and we know there are many, we should do everything we can to empower and support their efforts. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the question.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jose Luis Gonzalez Duvan, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I appreciate a lot the opportunity to talk this morning in this hearing. Before I make my statement, I would like to say that Guatemala is very different from El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Guatemala's judicial system has been severely damaged during the last 5 years. Its court of last resort, the Constitutional Court, has cast aside the Constitution and has ruled arbitrarily, causing great damage to our country and yours. Compounding this damage was the creation of the FECI, the Special Branch of the Public Prosecutor's Office Against Corruption and Impunity. The head of the FECI, Prosecutor Juan Francisco Sandoval, coordinated closely with the previous CC and likewise put politics above the law. He has multiple criminal charges against him, including by the state attorney. They are suppressed apparently because of US influence. I have never been involved in politics, nor have I held public office. I'm an attorney, professor of law, and media commentator. It is not my intention to be political here, but unfortunately I cannot refrain from mentioning some prominent US officials who have played a major role in Guatemala if I am to be accurate in talking about judicial independence in Guatemala. I assume all of you care about the rule of law. If any of you have supported people in my country who violate the law in positions of authority, I would attribute such support to not knowing our laws and the facts of what happens in Guatemala. I am more than happy to answer your questions today and in the future if you believe I can help you better understand our legal realities. The Obama administration illegally took over the public prosecutor's office in 2010. When they lost control of it in 2014, Joe Biden took charge, regained control over criminal prosecution in 2015, and added control of the CC in 2016. They achieved this result by coercion and threats, canceling US visas, placing their targets on a blacklist, and criminal investigations conducted by the CC. Former Ambassador Todd Robinson executed this strategy to place magistrates on our courts who would do his bidding regardless of law. As its major donor and political supporter, the CC always acted in concert with the embassy. Your diplomats and politicians always talk about an independent judiciary and transparency. If they are sincere, they should look at the public record. It is painful to listen to people praised as corruption fighters those who so obviously violate the law. It leads one to ask if such persons have an agenda to extinguish the constitutional system. 5 different entities each appoint a principal and alternate magistrate to the Constitutional Court. This year, unlike 2016 with Robinson in charge, our authorities resisted U.S. Embassy and White House intimidation and threats and appointed independent magistrates for the first time in 5 years. The previous Constitutional Court, from 2016 through 2021, illegally closed mining and hydroelectric companies, which provoked thousands of workers to immigrate illegally into the United States in search of work. The Judiciary protected violent NGOs that steal electricity, invade private property while armed, force campesinos to attack mining and hydroelectric installation, block roads, and pay people to go to cities to smash business, monuments, and public and private buildings. Groups such as Codeca, CONIC, Cook, and others like them are the equivalent of Black Lives Matter and Antifa in Guatemala. Their methods of destruction and intimidation are similar. The U.S. Embassy has controlled FECI since its beginning. It has persecuted the left's political enemies, which continues today. For this reason, the White House, State Department, and some in Congress and the media have made a great effort to give Sandoval a false profile. They invent prices for a false heroism and call Sandoval a fighter against corruption, offering him unconditional public support. Finally, Guatemala has begun to move toward the rule of law with truly independent judges. Some Democrats, the State Department, affirm the opposite. For them, judicial independence is to have a system they control, as they did under Biden when he was vice president. This is the time to stop supporting criminality in our system. If you want to help us create rule of law, at least don't oppose us and impose a criminal system on us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Irina Bykova?
I'm here. It is a great honor to have your attention, and our family is very grateful for this. I will go straight to the core of the problem. As you might know, our family has been politically persecuted by Kremlin for over a decade now. We still find ourselves in a perilous situation. In the 1990s, Igor and we founded a successful pulp and paper company in Russia called Northwest Timber Company. It was valued at nearly $500 million. That's when the problems started.
I'm not gonna.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. One of the Putin's bankers, Shas, asked to sell 51% of the business for $25 million. We refused. I was asked to become a representative of Putin's political party in Moscow. I refused. Consequently, our daughter, when 16-year-old, was kidnapped and raped for 3 days on the orders of Kremlin. And this traumatic event provoked a number of grave illnesses in Anastasia. Up to this day, she needs constant treatment and medicine. Our story has many similarities to that of Bill Browder. First, Russian officials steal everything from us when they accuse us of theft. And we came to Guatemala to escape persecution, but the Kremlin caught up with us and used its influence to encourage Guatemalan prosecutors, judges, and even magistrates to fabricate a case against our family. We had a local law firm, Coutinho International, that offered citizenship services and governmental protection, but told us the process was completely legal. Thousands of foreign citizens acquired Guatemalan passport in this way, but we were the only ones to face criminal prosecution. We were considered part of a criminal group issuing passports and tried with a group of low-level officials. My husband received a 90-year jail sentence for passport violation. My daughter and I, 14 years each. The people who authorized and signed our documents, including the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Vice President of Migration Office, Mayra Belis, were never investigated. Russian officials have been involved in our case since 2013, when the now sanctioned Russian State Bank, VTB, presented a complaint against our family. The complaint did not proceed of the lack of evidence. However, until CSIC got involved. In 2014, the president of VTB Bank, Andrei Kostin, signed a power of attorney to Henry Conte, who is a magistrate of Constitutional Court of Guatemala, while the president of another sanctioned entity, Gazprom Bank, Andrei Akimov, signed a power of attorney to Guatemalan lawyer Alfonso Carrillo, who is a close friend of the head of CSIC, Ivan Velasquez. On 3rd of November 2014, Ivan Velasquez personally asked Attorney General Thelma Aldana to merge the complaint of VTB Bank with a human trafficking case known as the migration case, as well to assign the case to a particular prosecutor of FECI, Stuardo Campo. Right afterward, our family was arrested and imprisoned while our 3-year-old son was sent to an orphanage. My daughter and when our son was abused physically and psychologically. My daughter and I spent a year and a half in preventive prison, and my husband 3.5 years. Meanwhile, the fabricated case against us proceeded. There was a complete lack of evidence, but that did not matter to the prosecutors or judges. At the request of CSIC, VTB Bank was named as co-plaintiff in the migration case against us. The formal accusation was that there were anomalies in the official documents issued to us by the Guatemalan government. In February 2015, the Russian Ministry of Interior Affairs sent a request for mutual legal assistance on our case to Guatemalan authorities. Guatemala and Russia do not have an agreement of mutual legal assistance. Nevertheless, the Guatemalan authorities cooperated. On 5th of October, 3 months before the trial began, Judge Erika Aifan sent a letter to Russian embassy indicating the jail sentences that we will receive. Constitutional Court and Court of Appeals issued us constitutional protection twice, stating that no crime was committed. Yet they still permitted the judges to sentence us. This abuse were committed under the former president of the Constitutional Court, Gloria Porras. During the imprisonment, my husband was tortured by judges Erika Aifan and Jasmine Barrios, who later were found guilty of torture by the National Commission of Prevention of Torture. We presented an appeal of prejudice to the Supreme Court of Justice against these two judges. However, it was declined on the grounds that the appeal was presented out of vengeance. Meanwhile, in Russia, VTB Bank made numerous statements recognizing the role of CSIC in imprisoning our family, while state channels called our imprisonment a victory of Russian intelligence services. In prison, my daughter and I were asked to testify against my husband, Igor. The questions were sent by the public ministry on behalf of the Russian Attorney General. Right now, we are all under house arrest and can be sent back to prison to any moment. The Court of Appeals last year confirmed the absurd sentences of 40 years for me and my daughter. My husband was notified yesterday after a retrial that Court of Appeals not only confirmed his sentences but augmented it, adding 2 years of prison more, as was asked by the public ministry. The miscarriage of justice by the Guatemalan judicial body was committed not only in our case but in many others as well. The most outrageous ones are Odebrecht, Sigma, and Bantrap case. Odebrecht and Sigma, with help of Guatemalan officials, stole $650 million from Guatemalan budget. Bantrap is about laundering of Nicolas Maduro regime money from Guatemalan bank Bantrap. CSIC covered it up by imprisoning scapegoats while protecting the real criminals. I can offer additional information later if necessary. Honorable members of the Lantos Human Rights Commission, I ask you to please look into these unthinkable abuses committed openly by the Guatemalan judicial system. We are in legal limbo. We are under house arrest and have no documents and no ability to work and earn a living. It is incomprehensible to me how Guatemalan and Russian officials would want to torture my children. I cannot describe to you what they have been through. Our nightmare is still not over. We are only alive thanks to the intervention of Bill Browder, who took a personal interest in our case and brought it to the Helsinki Commission and to the US Congress. We have learned that as enemies of the Russian state, we cannot possibly assert our rights in Guatemala. Thank you very much. And if you permit me just 1 minute, я насчет petition хочу сказать.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Now, Brittany Benowitz.
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, thank you for the opportunity to be here to talk about this important topic. The President of the American Bar Association has repeatedly expressed concerns about attacks on the judiciary in Central America. Today, I'll outline how those attacks are undertaken, why they're important, and what can be done about it. Before I outline the most recent events, let me just turn quickly to the ABA's experience in this region. So the ABA has provided technical assistance to justice sector personnel in over 100 countries around the world. For the last 10 years, we've been providing technical assistance to the justice sector in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and we've monitored multiple proceedings in Honduras and Guatemala to select high court judges, as well as pending criminal cases concerning corruption in these countries and frivolous complaints against prosecutors and judges. On the basis of this experience, it is our conclusion that there is a well-coordinated, well-financed campaign to attack judges and prosecutors who have been working on anti-corruption cases, particularly in Guatemala. This campaign has two prongs to it. The first is to control the means to select judges and the means to remove them. The second prong of the conspiracy is to threaten the judges through frivolous criminal complaints and online disinformation campaigns. Let me turn first to the first prong of the conspiracy. I will focus my comments on Guatemala, where we've done a significant amount of work, but let me state at the outset that there are similar trends throughout the region. In Guatemala, we have documented significant irregularities and successive processes to select high court judges. The authorities in both Honduras and Guatemala refused to conduct basic information necessary to ascertain the credibility of the judges. And in Guatemala, we have seen the appointment of judges about whom we have serious concerns of their ethical behavior to the highest courts in the country. And meanwhile, judges with a demonstrated record of independence have been denied a seat on the bench. As a result of this, credible allegations of high-level corruption that have captured key ministries in the government have been dismissed by the now Constitutional Court of Guatemala, which has been effectively captured by people who have been indicted previously on corruption charges. Obviously, in El Salvador, it's a different mechanism. They're controlling the means to remove the judges. And the attack on the Constitutional Chamber in El Salvador was a brazen attack. At the same time, we have to understand that the impact is the same. In both cases, we have a situation where the judiciary has been captured and is no longer able to serve as an independent check on government abuse. That's the first prong of the conspiracy. The second prong is the threatening of judges. In Guatemala, civil society has documented over 100 frivolous complaints against justice sector personnel. Now, we have ourselves monitored proceedings in over a dozen cases, interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed thousands of pages of court documents, and can tell you without doubt that these claims against many of these judges are frivolous. In Honduras, it's even worse. We've seen cases of judges who've been killed and the government never investigates. In light of these challenges, we have a number of recommendations on how the United States can address these challenges. It's important to understand that there's nothing that the United States is trying to accomplish in this region, whether it's addressing migration, narcotics trafficking, or even creating a level playing field for Mexican businesses to invest. None of those things can be accomplished without a credible justice sector. We should therefore put this as a high priority, and we therefore welcome the news that the White House has announced the creation of an interagency task force. As I said at the outset, the President of the American Bar Association has expressed concern repeatedly about threats on the judiciary, and we are currently considering as an association our policy recommendations on that. In the interim, I offer today my personal views on the way forward based on my 10 years of experience monitoring these proceedings in the region. While the situation is grim, there remains a significant opportunity for turning things around. If we establish an interagency task force that has significant investigative capacity, there is a body of evidence already developed by CSIG and others that can be used in order to defenestrate and vet the justice sector in order to enable us to protect and expand pockets of independence within the justice sector. That will require us to move beyond simply denying visas. That has not proven to be an effective deterrent. The key here is that we need to be beyond denying visas for the low-level operators who are passing bribes in these influence peddling schemes. We need to get to the intellectual authors and the financiers behind that. In order to do that, what we need to do is apply well-established principles for combating organized crime that we use in the United States. In the United States, if an organization systematically threatens judges, that is considered an offense under our racketeering laws. Those same principles should be applied to global Magnitsky. It doesn't require a change in the law. It just requires implying global Magnitsky to its full extent and using financial sanctions to go after those who are paying for these threats against these judges and to stack the courts with corrupt judges. Moreover, there are assets and individuals in the United States who are within the jurisdiction of our own criminal laws who should be investigated. Therefore, I think the emphasis really needs to be that the interagency task force has to have dedicated officials from DOJ, hopefully dedicated officials from the Kleptocracy Initiative who have the capacity to pursue those investigations. I would also echo Mr. Schneider's comments that we have seen evidence that development assistance and the loans from the international financial institutions have, in violation of the bank's own due diligence laws, benefited people who've been indicted on corruption grounds. There should be a top to bottom review of those loans to ensure that they're not inadvertently strengthening those who are attacking the judiciary. Notwithstanding the fact that the threats are severe, I want to close by stating that anti-corruption efforts in the region have overwhelming popular support. And there's a cadre of trained judges, prosecutors, and lawyers who are committed to doing this work. We just need to create some breathing room for them to do their jobs, and we can turn the situation around. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank all the witnesses for testifying. Again, we need to get this. We need to kind of try to wrap up as close to 2 or a little bit after 2 as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first yield my time to Ms. Torres of California, then to Mr. Smith, then to Ms. Jackson Lee, and then I'll close. But before I do, I just want to just say something for the record. We've heard some names tossed around, U.S. officials who have been publicly criticized here today, especially with regard to sanctioning of certain Guatemalans, and I guess through the Global Magnitsky Act. And I just want to point out for the record, it's hard to get on that list. And there are people who I would like on that list that because of the review process, I can't get on that list. Same for Mr. Smith. And same for the president, by the way. So just because somebody says, I want X person on that list, doesn't mean they get on that list. There is a whole interagency review process, including the Treasury Department, the State Department, and others. So it is a long process. And with regard to the 2 Guatemalans that were mentioned earlier, I mean, they're not only on the U.S. Global Magnitsky list, the UK has sanctioned them as well. So I just point that out because I think we need to be very careful with how we characterize, those who have been called out for corruption, especially with regard to trying to influence this judiciary selection. So, if you're on the Magnitsky list in Russia or the Global Magnitsky list in any other country, it takes a lot of work to get on that list. It can't just be an accusation. There has to be a lot of stuff to convince all these departments that you are deserving for that. And I just point that out because I don't want to diminish the efforts to go into getting people on that list, not only under the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now currently under the Biden administration. So now I would yield to Ms. Torres for any questions. Again, if we can keep it succinct so we can get out of here by 2, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing us together today to highlight these very important issues and the issue of judicial independence in Central America. This issue is critical now, and independent institutions and investigations should not be evaluated in a vacuum on hearsay. They are critical to a functioning and healthy democracy. Co-opting and controlling the courts only helps to protect those in power and their personal interest. These attacks that we are seeing and the increasing erosion of independent judicial systems are a reflection of, the growing problem of authoritarianism in the region. In undemocratic countries across the world, the biggest threat to elites are independent and effective voices that speak truth to power and challenge the status quo. Not surprisingly, in the Northern Triangle, we are seeing the governments and their henchmen increasingly target the very few remaining independent institutions in civil society. In Guatemala, the lead of Special Prosecutor against Immunity, Juan Francisco Sandoval, Judge Erica Ifan, and States International Woman of the Year recipient, by the way, and the Human Rights Ombudsman, Jordan Rodas, endure a constant barrage of slander and retaliatory attacks for challenging the status quo. We've heard some of that here. This work comes at a great risk to those brave champions of the rule of law. many who have made real progress on this, including Ms. Paz. She had to leave the country after threats and attempted legal retaliation. We must immediately and effectively support these actors for their safety and allow them to carry out their mandates. So my first question is, in repressive environments like these, how can we help ensure the safety of judicial figures, investigators, and activists, while also enabling these workers to continue to work within the country? And can you also speak to the elimination of checks and balances and how that impacts rule of law in the region? And how can civil society in the Northern Triangle fill the void in critical efforts like the fight against corruption and upholding rule of law without the government's support? If we can start with Claudia Paz. Thank you for joining us today, Claudia.
Sí, muchísimas gracias, representante.
Yes, thank you very much, Representative Torres, for this very important question. Many of us agree that it's crucial to protect prosecutors, judges, human rights defenders, the independent press, because these are the last line of defense against authoritarianism. Political and economic support for these prosecutors and judges who continue to do their jobs is extremely important to prevent the erosion of the rule of law in these countries. I think it has also been mentioned here that the investigations from the United States into crimes such as money laundering, drug trafficking, such as the case being investigated regarding the brother of the Honduran president, Tony Hernandez, shows how these powerful forces in these countries are coming together and these structures are operating. So these investigations can change the balance of power in these countries to give greater space to judges and prosecutors who are doing their jobs. I think also the task force on anti-corruption that Vice President Kamala Harris has proposed is extremely important because this task force will help prosecutors who wish to prosecute acute cases of corruption and human rights violations. And of course, I cannot fail to mention that bilateral efforts are important to pursuing the political and economic interests that are obstructing advances in cases of corruption and of human rights violations. Thank you very much.
Olson, do you have anything to add to that or a response to my questions?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Torres, for the question and for your real long-term commitment to these issues in the U.S. Congress. I'm very grateful for your leadership on those issues. I think there are probably three areas where we can do help more than anything, and some of these have already been mentioned. I think the task force idea that was presented this week by the Vice President is really important for a variety of reasons. We can bring to the table a lot of technical know-how and expertise, but we can also create a buffer or space, as Brittany referred to it, some breathing room to these prosecutors and judges who are under constant assault. As you know, Judge Ifan has over 50 cases against her, many of them spurious cases that have no real merit. But it's a way to threaten and undermine her as an independent judge. And so I think that the relationship that we can build with these prosecutors and judges from the U.S. government's perspective with AID, DOJ, other offices is really important. Secondly, I think there's a role for civil society, which is the one I'm trying to play and this foundation is trying to play. When institutions are captured by corrupt officials, we have to have civil society playing a role. That's the role they played in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. They are the voice against corruption and authoritarianism, and we need to continue to strengthen those voices as well. And thirdly, I think we need to continue to use our tools in the international community, work with the European Union, work with the OAS, work with others to build a strong commitment to rule of law and democracy. The documents are there, the agreements are there in the international community. We just have to show leadership and bring people together to focus on those issues and ensure that they're not just paper and pronunciations, but mean something. Mean something in the case of Nicaragua, mean something in the case of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, before I ask my last question, I would like to have the opportunity at the end to include a response from either the former commissioner of CSIG or a representative. There's been some slanderous comments made against them, and I think that we should have a response for the record, and I would like an opportunity to do that at the end.
Without objection.
Thank you. Brittany, how can Congress and the U.S. government help lay the conditions that would allow for independent anti-corruption mechanisms in the region? And that would be my last question.
Representative Torres, I would also like to thank you for your leadership on this issue. First, with regards to your question about the Congress, I do believe that if we continue to see that the security sectors fail to investigate violent threats against journalists, civil society leaders, and judges, we should be conditioning our assistance to them on their compliance and with the fulfilling their obligation to investigate those threats. I also think, there's credible allegations of embezzlement in the Ministry of Defense in Guatemala. I question whether or not they should continue to be receiving security assistance from us until there's been a full accounting of what happened there. That's one of those prosecutions that was brought by CSIG that has stalled as a result of the threats against the judges. With regards to action in the executive branch, my position is that they have ample legislative authority to do what they need to do. It's a matter of changing the thinking of how we go about this. We need to think about the threats against the justice sector as a form of organized crime and apply well-established principles of combating organized crime. We need to look at the obstruction of justice. We need to look at the people who are doing that, some of whom there's very good grounds to be concerned they're involved in money laundering, that they may have assets in the United States. There's a lot that can be done to bring pressure to bear on them under US law, and there's also much that can be done through our sanctioning authority to go after people who have been financing these attacks. We've really only barely gone after the lower level operators involved in this conspiracy, and that's not going to be sufficient. The operators are interchangeable. The people who actually physically pass the bribe are not the people who are behind it. And so if you do not use the sanctioning authority to go toward the intellectual authors of these attacks on the judiciary, then we're not going to see any deterrent effect out of that sanctions regime. That said, I do think it's actually quite possible that we can turn the tide on this. And therefore, I think that if we do this concerted matter through an interagency task force, there is hope that if we can begin by protecting the justice sector itself, in time, they'll be able to stand on their own 2 feet and be able to finish the work of looking at the other issues that have been raised by the other panelists, including the campaign finance that has so corrupted key ministries that are fundamental to achieving U.S. objectives in the region.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Let me just raise one question, one response to the question about what can be done, and that is, Congressman Torres, it's rare that the Congress has focused on this issue of the independence of the judiciary and anti-corruption on the international financial institutions. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the IDB, they are critical in terms of support for the governments. They need to incorporate, and the Congress can ensure that they incorporate into their negotiations concern about independence of the judiciary. If we're concerned about economic growth and development, if these governments are engaging in corruption and destroying the rule of law, we're not going to see the kind of results that we want. So I think that that's crucial. The other is on protection for the individual judges and prosecutors and civil society. In Colombia, we've mounted a very strong effort in terms of protecting individuals. And I think that we need to use some of the lessons learned there to protect individual judges under attack and under threat. And I would note that CICIG helped establish the Special Methods Unit in the Ministerio Público in Guatemala, and they identified in 1 year 231 attempts to kill people, and as a result prevented it. We need to use the Interagency Task Force that's just been created to link up to those kinds of technical support in the different ministries and ensure that we essentially use our intelligence to help prevent violence against prosecutors.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Co-Chair Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for their testimony. I'd like to, Irina Bykova, your statement was very powerful. We ought to, all of us, be calling for justice for the Bitkoffs. And I find it appalling that there are too many people who look askance, too many people who think that, what you have been through, which is one of the gross miscarriages of justice I have ever seen. I work on political prisoners for 41 years. And I can tell you, your case is right at the top when the bank and the kleptocracy of Vladimir Putin follows you, first steals your assets, your bank, your company, then follows you, your daughter is raped, then follows you as you go to Latvia, then you went to Turkey, and then thought you had found a safe haven in Guatemala, only to be tracked down 5 years later by the Russians. They have very good intelligence. And it's beguiling to me as to why CICIG wanted to become a partner with Putin. That question has never been answered. Why did they merge your case with a human trafficking case? I wrote our law on human trafficking called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I take a backseat to no one in combating sex and labor trafficking. It's one of the most horrible offenses on the face of the earth, modern day slavery. To take a case where you got documents to protect yourself, almost like a witness protection mode, so that they wouldn't find you in order to get into Guatemala. You knew that they didn't have an extradition agreement with the Russians, so you knew it was a safer place where you thought to be. And then, as you pointed out in your testimony on November 3rd, 2014, Ivan Velasquez personally asked the general prosecutor, Thelma Adelana, to merge the complaint in the VTB Bank with a human trafficking case known as the migration case, and to assign a particular prosecutor. Right after that, you point out your husband, daughter, and you were arrested and imprisoned while your 3-year-old son was sent to an orphanage. That is an outrage. And we all should be calling for justice for the Bitkoffs and doing it aggressively. I was surprised some people who followed your testimony never even referenced back to it. You are persecuted by the long arm of the Russian government, Vladimir Putin and his banks. As Bill Browder pointed out, Gazprom Bank got involved as well, as did other Russian banks, because they wanted to send a message to anyone, if they don't agree to just forfeiting their assets to this kleptocracy, they'll follow you anywhere you go, anywhere in the world. So you're being made an example of by the Putin dictatorship. And I would hope that more members would be calling for we've never gotten an accounting from CICIG on this. I would love to have them come and testify. I have 30 questions I'd like to ask them in order to get to the record and get this straightened out. And you are owed a very, very serious apology by this whole process, by the enablers, wittingly or unwittingly, who look askance towards your case. When I held that hearing back in April of 2018, there were people who were trying to stop that hearing. Bill Browder, you pointed out, has been a champion for your case, as he was after he was killed for Sergei Magnitsky, in terms of bringing to light the dishonor of the Russian government, and now by working with them and partnering with them, the Guatemalans as well as CICIG. So Mr. Chairman, let's invite Velasquez to come and testify. I want to ask some real questions of him, and I'll do it too. I'll call the hearing. Secondly, I just want to say about judiciaries, very briefly, and Arana, you might want to just say a brief word. But, you know, all judiciaries have some level of politicization. Our own does. I mean, even now there's very serious talk about packing our court, because that's all about what are the outcomes when it comes to policy decisions. If there is corruption, thankfully, we have a very vigorous Justice Department that hopefully would go after that. But, you know, in many cases, courts have become super legislatures, having the last word on legislation. So the packing of the court, and we know in every presidential election, the issue of who goes on the courts in the United States is always a huge issue, especially for the United States Supreme Court. So I just want to, you know, we've got to be very, but again, countenancing no corruption, and the rules need to be followed. So we need to continually rededicate ourselves to that. So Rana, if you just want to have the last word on this, I would like to yield to you. But again, I thank you for your courage and what you and your husband and family have been through. Remember, and I think most members may not know this, but they were on a tear, frankly, to take your son, who was born in Guatemala, and send him back to Russia, to an orphanage there. Thankfully, your lawyers and you and your husband were able to stop that. And getting him back, had they deported him like that, probably would have never happened, and you would have not seen your son again. One injustice after another. CICIG should have been on the side, and the Guatemalan court, of protection. You are an asylum seeker, and you should have gotten asylum and the protection you deserve. Irina?
Thank you very much, Christopher Smith. I'm very grateful you for your support, for your courage. My daughter helped me to translate. Смотри, что я была шокирована, как большинством выступающих вообще была проигнорирована наша трагедия. Они как ни в чем не бывало поддерживали Айфана, говорили хорошо.
I was shocked how other witnesses responded to our tragedy. They completely ignored it and continued as if nothing happened. And this is exactly what is happening here in Guatemala as well. People simply ignore it and continue with their lives as if nothing has happened.
Я услышала много о том, что если кто-то что-то сказал, это значит на суде и на СИСИК наговаривают. У меня под каждым моим словом есть long time. У меня все прописано, а я от них, кроме слов честное, хорошее, справедливое, вообще ничего не слышала.
My mother is saying that she heard a lot of words like hearsay or we can't sanction somebody because she said or he said. And my mother wants to say that we have evidence under each single word that we said. We have evidence for every single word, physical evidence. However, she can see that other witnesses who are saying that or accusing us of hearsay, they do not have evidence. So there are a lot of people who are saying that, oh, somebody is brave and somebody is a champion of justice, but there is no evidence of that. While we do have evidence and we have submitted it before the hearing, so it can be seen.
Да, и единственное человеческое участие, которое я здесь вижу, это только Кристофера Смита.
And my mother is saying, and I agree, that the only human response that we can see here is yours, Mr. Smith. And thank you very much for
paying attention.
Thank you. And I just would mention, I would ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, that we include statements from Calderon, an attorney, Rafael Estrada, Steve Hecht, and Jared Gesser. And I just would say what I think will be the next speaker, Sheila Jackson Lee, was at our hearing, you might recall, Arena, and was very eloquent in her defense of you at that hearing as well. So I thank you. And there are many friends here, Marco Rubio, for example, and I and many others, Senator Wicker, who care deeply about your family, and we're not going to give up on this. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I should also say for the record, we had appealed on behalf of the Bikovas early on, quite frankly, before anybody else on this committee for mercy in this case. I examined this case very, very carefully. It's complicated. Nonetheless, I understand what you have all been through. I mean, we urge that you be allowed to seek asylum in a third country if that could somehow lessen your ordeal.
Yes.
But I should also say,
Yes.
okay, I'm going to yield to you next, Sheila. but I should also just remind everybody, as we're having this discussion here today, CICIG no longer exists in Guatemala. And so, but in any event,
Mr. Chairman, if you would yield on that for one point, yes, we all know that, but past injustices need to be held to account, and we must learn from it.
Yeah, and I agree with it. And I've examined this case very, very closely. You can make a request to the former head of CICIG if you want. I regret, this is my opinion, that this case has been used as a way to go after an organization that I think has actually done a great service. Now, we have a difference of opinion on that, and I don't believe the CICIG is the mastermind behind all of what has just been said. But having said all of that, the Vikovas, we certainly are sympathetic as to your situation, and that's why many of us early on tried to see whether there was a way out of this for you. But if we want to get into the specific charges and the complications of this case, that leads us to a longer discussion, and I don't think we ought to go there. But anyway, let me yield to Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and certainly it's been an important hearing, and to Mrs. Smith as well. Thank you. As many members say, I'll be brief, but because I have to catch an airplane back to Washington, I will be brief. Out of 141 countries, the World Economic Forum's 2019 Global Competitiveness Report ranked the three Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras on their lack of independence on their judiciaries. El Salvador ranked 95th, Guatemala ranked 100, and Honduras ranked 108. I'd like to ask both Ms. Benowitz and Mr. Olson to give their thoughts on path forwards regarding the civil society, regarding the present governments in terms of trying to secure or increase the independence of the judiciary, where victims can actually be addressed. On the previous question dealing with the previous witness, I look forward to working with my colleagues on this very complicated case. But I'd appreciate it if you all, both of you, Ms. Benowitz and Mr. Olson, would take that question. Starting with Mr. Olson, thank you so very much. And thank you to the witnesses, and thank you to both Mr. McGovern and Mr. Smith. Mr. Olson.
Yes, thank you, Representative Jackson-Lee. Really appreciate the question. I continue to believe that in situations where the judiciary and the political structures are dominated by oligarchs and elites that aren't interested in upholding the rule of law, that civil society has an incredibly important role to play. And it's really important for those of us in civil society and those of you in government to find ways to support them through U.S. assistance programs, politically, a lot of different ways. One of the reasons countries like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras attack independent journalism, attack independent civil society, is because they dislike their role in accountability, in reporting on government. I know that probably many of you in Congress have suffered criticisms from journalists that you don't particularly like or
Mr.
want.
Olson, my time is going, and
okay.
If you can summarize so I can hear from the other witness. Thank you.
Yeah, I think without a doubt, we have to be aware that the institutions of the judiciary are deeply penetrated and controlled in almost all these cases, and we have to support civil society in that way. And there's multiple ways to do that.
Thank you. Ms. Benowitz, in actuality, I have about a minute. Ms. Benowitz, are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. We have seen civil society take up the mantle where the local justice sector has failed. It was civil society actors, former prosecutors, who were commissioned to investigate the killing of Berta Cáceres, and the disappearance of the 43 students in Mexico. You could establish a standing commission of former prosecutors and judges who are not able to find work in their own countries because they've been blacklisted, and empower them to help in these investigations. That would be a very powerful way to work around the lack of independence that currently exists in the justice sector. My last suggestion is that with regard to the pending processes to select court judges, especially in Guatemala, the local process is thoroughly broken and it's well documented. In Colombia, they used a panel of experts. It was a hybrid between international experts and local experts.
I have 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I like your ideas. Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't mean the clock to be that unforgiving when we talked about trying to 5 minutes. Let me
appreciate your kindness, Chairman. Thank you.
But I'm going to just ask a series of questions, but just if you can answer briefly. Mr. Olson, you mentioned the new regional anti-corruption mechanism that was launched last week. Can you say a little bit more about this and how it will work, and how will its members be protected from retaliation? Unmute.
Yeah, my apologies. Thank you. Great question. You know, I think in the context of the assault against civil society and independent civil society, the reaction of people in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala has been to come together and work regionally to defend one another and to elevate to the international community what we're all doing. These are organizations that have experience in monitoring, reporting, and investigating corruption, reporting on impunity in their countries. They are under assault. There's cases being built today against some of our members in El Salvador by the Bukele government. And so they feel strongly that they need to come together, work together on this issue of independence of judiciary, corruption, and impunity. And I think it's really important that we see them as one element of a strategy, not the only one, but one element of a strategy to hold governments accountable where there is a tendency towards authoritarianism.
Thank you. Claudia, you mentioned the tendency throughout the region to criminalize human rights defenders, journalists, and even civil servants. You yourself have been a victim of baseless and frivolous legal complaints. These situations can be difficult for the international community because it can seem like we're interfering in the judicial processes. So could you say a little bit more about how criminalization works and how we can recognize it when it happens, and how do you think we should respond?
Muchísimas gracias, representante.
Thank you for that question, Representative. I think it is a very important question. I think one thing that we have talked a lot about today is that one of the elements or one of the patterns that can indicate criminalization is first the context. For example, in Nicaragua, where there is no judicial independence and the Supreme Court is subservient to the executive power, that is a strong indication of an environment in which criminalization cases can occur. Second, the profiles of victims, the people who suffer criminalization, tend to be those judges, prosecutors, journalists who have denounced cases of abuse of power. So in such cases, it is likely that they are suffering a case of criminalization. Another element of these trends or these patterns are the crimes that are charged. For example, the judge Gloria Porras has more than 60 complaints against her. These are all baseless accusations for cases that we lawyers call victimless crimes. These are, for example, crimes against the administration of justice, abuse of power, cases where there is no physical person who is denouncing an injustice against them. They are cases that are, so to speak, against the state. For example, yesterday, the cases presented against several opposition candidates in Nicaragua are clear cases without victims. cases against the institutions of the state. I think it is also very important that we be conscious that criminalization is also one of the modern ways to attack the work of human rights defense. And so reporting and being able to have spaces like this hearing, to discuss these issues is extremely important to us. I would leave my response there.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider, can you elaborate on how multilateral institutions, you mentioned this before, but how the IMF, the World Bank, and IDB and others can incorporate concerns about corruption and rule of law into their lending negotiations? Do the benchmarks for this already exist?
Well, clearly, some of the benchmarks exist in the sense that the banks themselves and IMF have said that their ability to promote economic investment, economic development rests on the rule of law functioning. And when it doesn't, then the hopes for investment, whether it's private investment or whether it's public investment, are unlikely to succeed. And so therefore, it's reasonable to ask the banks to ensure that as they look at the factors of whether or not they should provide significant budget support for countries, whether those countries are in fact maintaining the rule of law, supporting anti-corruption institutions, and taking actions that ensure that the rights of individuals are not violated. And I think that the situation now is one in which we can play a role. We have not, doesn't seem to me, we have not engaged, for example, with the IMF, which is involved in a critical negotiation with El Salvador, on the fact that they just essentially threw out the Constitutional Court judges, and in an afternoon, without any compliance with the Constitution, named new people, including serious questionable people. It seems to me that that should be part of the discussion of the IMF with El Salvador. And similarly, when you're talking about each of the banks has a private development lending effort, like our DFC. Well, if we have information about businesses engaging in corruption, we should provide it to those agencies in order to ensure that they don't finance corrupt businesses.
Right. Dr. Gonzalez, I just want to make sure that because when I finish here, I think we're done, but I want to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to say what they want. I mean, listening to your testimony, basically, and I'm simplifying it, but you're basically saying that places like Guatemala, should be able to do their own thing, and basically, U.S. is interfering, other countries are interfering, when they support these international institutions designed at getting at issues like impunity. I mean, but basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, it's like we could do it without anybody. Am I understanding that correctly?
Right, and thank you very much.
Yeah, and before you answer, let me just add the question. If that's the case, then what the hell's been going on for the last several decades when the issue of corruption is under control? But you go ahead.
Let me tell you what has been going on.
Okay.
You have been listening to the wrong people.
Okay.
You have been supporting the false civil society. I am astonished to see the false narratives that I have heard this morning here. It seems to me that the real truth is 180 degrees apart. Unfortunately, the left has made a strong lobby for years in the US, and we, the simple citizens, don't have any chance to be here. So this is an extraordinary opportunity. I don't think that anybody has had this opportunity in Guatemala before me. I'm not stating on the oath, but believe me, I'm telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Yeah. And you can come and check the facts here. I will be glad to wait on you here and take you to the facts.
Yeah, I guess my response to that was that as somebody who's visited Guatemala on several occasions over the years, and have seen human rights defenders murdered, church and faith-based leaders murdered, and there's been no justice, it's hard to believe that the judicial system and the court system and the justice system is working the way anybody, no matter what you may think. And by the way, whether you're on the right or the left, as Chairman Smith pointed out in the beginning, everybody should be entitled to justice, right? Everybody should be treated equally under the law. And so if you want to characterize everybody as being left-wing and somehow it justifies their persecution, that can't be right either. And so I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your perspective. I'm just saying that, and again, we're talking about Guatemala with you, but in general, there should, no matter what your politics may be, people should be concerned about the backsliding of democracy and just the undercutting of the judicial system. And I think that's something we all ought to be concerned about. Ms. Bakova, I just say to you, when your case was brought to my attention early on from Bill Browder, we did advocate on your behalf, and I guess where we diverge is that CICIG, which no longer exists in Guatemala, so it's kind of beside the point, that somehow that was the culprit here. It was the public ministry that prosecuted your case, not CICIG. And then my colleague Norma Torres just reminded me that under the Trump administration, the acting principal deputy assistant secretary of state for WHA stated, quote, "Our embassy and department have looked into these allegations of collusion and thus far have found no evidence that it has occurred." So that's the Trump administration. That's not the Biden administration. That's not the Obama administration. It's the Trump.
My friend Yield, my good friend Yield.
Happy to yield.
I thank you. As you know, you had asked that question about CICIG to Bill Browder after my hearing, and he did provide a very detailed answer, which I would ask to be a part of our record. But as he goes through his timeline, he points out that the Russian bank, VTB, complaint against Bitcoin is accepted by CICIG on November 13, 2014. And then just 2 months later, the court issues a warrant. And then there's all this verbiage coming out of the Russians about how they're working hand in glove with CICIG in going after the Bitcoin. So again, I would love to have a much more in-depth investigation, just hasn't happened. Because let's invite Velasquez to come and testify.
I never quote the Trump administration, but
this is Bill Browder.
Yeah, no, but Browder's timeline, and I am friends and respect Bill Browder, is partial and incomplete, I would say.
I think it's partial.
And so I would, but having said, no, I'm not trying to.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, several of our witnesses talked about other people who had.
I'm not trying to
charges against them, and without anywhere near the
yeah. I just want to
documentation.
I just want to make sure that we are directing our concerns at the culprits here, and that we're focused on that. But anyway,
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Ms. Torres.
I apologize. There is a huge piece of the Guatemalan community missing in this conversation. We spent close to an hour talking about the unfortunate incident that happened to this Russian family, who decided to pay for fake documents because of whatever it was that they believed was going to happen to them. As it had happened to them in the past. We haven't said one single word about, what's happened to the indigenous populations in Guatemala. The people, the brown-skinned people, we forget about the fact that Afro-descendants, have absolutely zero justice in these countries. I am sorry to be the one to rain on your parade. And, I thank you, everyone, for caring about one Russian family. But, we need to be caring about, the plight of the indigenous people that have been murdered. And now their murderers are going to be set free because the courts in the region have said that they do not want to go after them. what is wrong with what this hearing where you have gone totally, the other way and forgotten, what human rights and what we're fighting for. Mr. Chairman, thank you for trying to bring us back to the reality, of what has happened to, to the invisible people, that look like me and Representative Sheila Jackson in the region that have never heard, never.
So,
Chairman, if I might, before you close, I'd like to.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, Sheila. Then I want to go to Ms. Bakova, and then I have a question for Ms. Benowitz, and then I'm done. But I want to go to Ms. Jackson-Lee first, and then I will go to you, Ms. Bakova. Okay.
Thank you so very much. Well, I will first associate myself with the distinguished gentlelady from California, but I'll put on my judiciary hat and indicate that my deep passion is that the third branch of government in whatever jurisdiction is in fact an effective branch, and that no matter what language the scales of justice are, Lady Justice is, whatever language, it should be just. I have a sizable Guatemalan community in my community, and have spoken with those who have fled, and I'd like to, at this moment, dispute anyone's suggestion that people are fleeing out of just having a good Sunday walk to the United States. These people are fleeing desperation. They're being killed. They're lacking justice. And obviously, I do want to acknowledge the Biden administration for their courageous stance in trying to deal with the Northern Triangle. This is in relation to this human rights hearing, and Vice President Kamala Harris's visit, and of course, some mere or basic agreements. But we have to realize that we are in trouble when we're in the Northern Triangle, and that there are people who are suffering every day. I think this commission can be extremely helpful in being pronounced about the intolerance of lack of suffering, allowing this to at least continue without our voice. And I do think that the civil society can be helpful. I like what the witness said in terms of civil society persons from outside of Guatemala, but we have a crisis, and it should not be ignored that our administration went to the Northern Triangle. They're going to the border. No one is ignoring the border, but you do have to get to the root, and it's desperation. It's a judiciary that doesn't work. It's a violation of human rights, and it's murder. So I look forward to our voices having an impact. Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much. And I yield back to you.
And I appreciate your voice. I appreciate Ms. Torres's voice and Co-Chair Smith's voice, who I know cares deeply about human rights issues. And on most issues, we're all kind of in sync. But going back to what Ms. Torres said, I mean, a genocide occurred in Guatemala, and there was never any justice. And I think there's this view that there needs to be more accountability, obviously more transparency, and more justice. And I've lost many people, many friends that I have known in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, have all been persecuted, and there's no justice. And when I hear governments talk to me about the rule of law, and the rule of law is whatever whoever's in power wants it to be, that's where the problem is, right? So, Ms. Bakova, I apologize, but I mean, briefly, if there's any last words you want to say to us, we would certainly welcome that. And we're grateful that you're at this hearing. You have to unmute. Yeah.
Thank you.
I believe that the question here should be not just how to only protect judges and prosecutors, but how can victims on their corruption be protected as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. So, Ms. Benowitz, I mean, all right, you're the closer here. So help tie all this together, and into like what are the next steps that you think we should pursue in this commission and in Congress? Because I think that we're all committed to a system of justice that is equal for everyone. By the way, including here in the United States. And when we talk about lapses, injustices, I mean, we also have to acknowledge that we're we're not perfect here either, and we have a lot to do to work on a more just system in this country as well. But I'll give you the last word.
Well, that is quite intimidating with such an esteemed panel of experts. Let me just say that no matter what your position is on CC, the bottom line is that without a credible independent justice sector in these countries, the United States cannot achieve any of its objectives. I mentioned earlier the embezzlement case in the Ministry of Defense. In the same time period that the US taxpayer provided the people of Guatemala 100 million in security assistance, they embezzled 70 million. That's 70 cents on the dollar of what the American taxpayer provided was embezzled. We know this because of CC, and because of FESI, we know that the people involved in that scheme are continuing to try to stack the courts. We need FESI. There are eyes and ears on the ground. Without them, we're flying blind. So I hope that we can rise above this ideological dispute, not get sucked into the ideological dispute in Guatemala, and look with clear-eyed vision about what do we need to accomplish in order to stem the flow of migration and to promote economic development in the region so that people can stay in their home countries where they want to be and live lives of dignity.
So before I close, let me ask my good friend, Mr. Smith, whether there's anything he wants to add for the record before we wrap this up.
No, thank you very much. I think it was a very good hearing. I do thank you for your empathy, especially for Irina and her family. I think, I'm a great believer, and this is why, whether it be Natan Sharansky, the great Jewish refusenik, or Nelson Mandela, or any other person who has suffered, they are often a tip of the iceberg. So if there's corruption against the Bitkoffs, there is very likely corruption at a whole other lot of levels. And I've always been worried about accountability, especially for those. I asked Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, about the Bitkoffs in a one-on-one meeting with him. And he said he has no accountability. First, he didn't know much about the case, and I could understand that, or CICIG itself. But then he did say, and we did follow up with him, that where is the accountability? Who actually oversees the people who are, to make sure that absolutely everything is fair, and there's the prosecutorial discretion has no other agenda. It's just, you go after the bad guys and the bad players. Thank you, Chairman.
Let me just close with this. One of the reasons why I feel strongly about this issue, I did a lot of human rights work in El Salvador when I was a young congressional aide. In 1981, in 1989, we investigated the murders of the 6 Jesuit priests, her housekeeper and her daughter, who were murdered at the University of Central America. There was no justice in that case. In 1981, in a village called El Mozote, over 1,000 people were murdered, were massacred. The official stance of the U.S. government during the 1980s was it never happened. When the war was over, a forensic team went in there and dug it and found a shallow grave and identified all these remains. Most of the people that were killed were women, but were children, were also children. And I visited El Mozote. I took my daughter with me there, and as she was reading the list of victims, they would have a name and they have an age, and there were a lot of names with 0 after the names, because these were infants so young that they had no idea really how old they were. And that was in 1981. And in El Salvador today, there's an attempt to try to get some justice in that case. And the powers that be, notwithstanding the fact that they all have told us to our face they want justice, are doing everything they can to make sure there's no justice on a massacre that happened in 1981. If we can't get a system, a judiciary system, to work on a case like that, where there's all this international attention, then how the hell are we going to get it to work, when, some, lesser known human rights defender or some business person or whoever, right, who is not so prominent, is wronged. Doesn't work. And so, we need an independent judiciary. In this country, we need, and the people of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua deserve it in their countries as well. And I think some of the recommendations here about what we can do, maybe some regional approaches, using some of the international organizations that have some juice as well. But this is important. And to those, in other countries who are listening, I hope that you know that we take this very seriously. So I thank you all for being here. And with that, this ends the hearing, and everybody be safe.